So we're looking at the sort of some of the building that was going on here at the time. There wasn't really a great deal of building in this period. There was sort of maybe building just 20, 30 houses a year. And some of those were quite large houses still, especially the ones up on Scotland Lane. The Newley development had really come to an end. I think the last house was 1882, 83, that I could find out about, largely because of the smell down there, the state of the roads, the dye works on the other side, there's the glue works, steel works and all that going on, which I'd mentioned earlier but when we set off. So really that had come to an end, and but they'd actually put quite a lot of money into the local board. They estimated that the added £1,600 to the rateable value of the township, and because it was a very smelly, very dirty place. The roads were in an appalling state down there, and so they were obviously, the sewage was being discharged into there straight down the road. There was no main sewers because that was coming along in sort of 1885, 1886. So that was a great problem. And if it went down the hill, it went down the hill and straight into the river. And so really we see that the building that was going on, they had to come through to the local board to approve the plans. They demanded the thorough plans of where the drains were going to go as well, because they knew they had to build a main sewage all the way through the town. So they kept rejecting them unless they show where the drain was going to go. And really the sort of houses that were being seen at this time, there was Mr. Broadbent, and he was building Hopwood Bank just off Long Row down there. He didn't want to build a road into them because he claimed that the road in front, because they faced south, was Bachelor Lane, and therefore that was the road that the people accessed. Anybody who lives down there or walked up the Ginnell onto Hopwood Bank will tell you how steep that is, and it was an impossibility. He said it was a coach road, but anybody who walked down that public footpath, you can see how steep it is. So that was some of the houses being built along there, and some of the other ones were built off Town Street. They called it at that time Quarry Hill as well, and some of the other houses on Bachelor Lane were being built at that time in these 1880, 1881 years as well. But there really was no planning at all. These were just on really an ad hoc basis that were being built. Mr. Broadbent, to say he was building houses on Hopwood Bank, he was also on the local board as well. This is Richard Broadbent. His father had been on the board and came back onto the board, but this is his son, who's aged about 30 odd, and he was a quarry owner as well. He was selling stone around the place, and he said at one of the local board meetings, it's far better to have a line and let them build to it, talking about the constructors, the architects as well, than have houses erected in the irregular and zigzag manner as at present. Because that's really the problem that we see really down Town Street, is that it was very narrow, and we know that one property stuck out of Mr. Westerman, who was a master painter and decorator. We always go by his house because it narrowed Town Street down. I reckon it's probably in the area maybe where Morrison's is today, but I'm not going to say I'm not 100% sure. Is on the 1881 census of living down there, but it's quite hard to identify which his house is, because they always claim Mr. Westerman's Corner. It's always called coming down there. So there was some development coming around here. Obviously, Quarry Road is off Town Street by the unique Chinese takeaway, and those are some of the houses that were built on there. Obviously called Quarry because if you go down there today, you can still see the old quarry where they built the much more modern flats in the area behind that. And I can say coming further up, within that area is really Kerry Street and others like that. But I think that's comes in the next period as well of building Kerry Street. So let's have a look at the sort of education that was going around at the time. This is a picture of Crag Hill Baptist Church, or a chapel, and it was partly used for a Sunday school as well. I'm just showing that because it is a slightly different photograph than showing one of maybe Woodside or whatever it is. But there were really the two national schools around, St Margaret's and St James. A Sunday school has been built behind Providence Chapel at the bottom of Broadgate Lane. That cost £200 and opened in September 1880. It was also rented out as an infant school, largely because St James's School wasn't large enough. We see an increase in the population down in Woodside and the building of the first building of houses along Low Lane away from Woodside Hill, or the end of Outward Lane, where really the core of Woodside was until that time. And so the school wasn't big enough to accommodate all the children. Like I say, it comes into the next period as well, when they built an extension onto that. And so one way of relieving the Woodside school was by having the infants go into and hiring the back of Providence school chapel down there as well. And the population had risen down there because they were mostly people working in the mills and other industries which were down there. And attendance was incredibly poor at Woodside National School. It averaged most months around about 53%. And it caused a lot of problem. The vicar there, the Reverend Goodall, because they called on people to send their children to school, to say that it was overcrowded as well. So I don't quite get where this is, but I think is that that they were only paid on attendance. So or they might have 180 on the books. Is that probably similar today? Is that the children put some money in to pay about a pence 1d a week, but in fact they got a grant on top of that from how many children attended on the days that it was open. And that was really down to the school attendance officer, who was who was employed, but was also part of the local board as well. And so he went round weekly and then had to pull out children, or their parents go to their houses and then issue them with a summons to go down to Leeds into court, where they'd be fined and then have to send their children to school. They made all sorts of excuses. One of the main ones is that they always wanted someone to be in their house because they feared is that they will be burgled by somebody at the time. A lot of people said that. So there must have been a lot of maybe petty pilfering around from house to house. Others said is that because some of them had quite large families, they needed the elder child to be at home while the parents went out to work, and they had to look after the younger children round there as well. Others said, probably an excuse today, but their children were perpetually ill, but they called upon a note from the doctor to prove that as well. And it's a Providence chapel down there. We've mentioned it before, not quite shown what it's about, but it was established as a breakaway from the Woodside Wesleyans, the chapel standards down there today. And they broke away from them around about 1860. And then met in a blacksmith's workshop around the corn mill, and then the chapel opened in 1864. So we're coming up to the development of a Mechanics Institute, which actually opens a couple of years, a year later after this period I'm looking at the moment. But it had already been established, and they were sort of holding night classes in technical subjects, and they were roughly aged from 12 to 21 who would go there as well, and slightly over. But they were doing some technical things, but it was left to other sort of churches to step in, and they could go to Crag Hill Evening School to be taught by John Gallagher, and he had 32 pupils enrolled down there, 15 boys and 17 girls. His average weekly attendance was 17. They were just taught reading, writing and arithmetic. I guess it's these people who didn't go to school, or because they did go to school and didn't learn anything down there as well. Those are the same subjects that were taught by the Friends Adult School as well, which until the opening of the mission on Hall Lane in 1885, I think that is, also used Craghill Baptist Schoolroom as well. The adults school had been established in September 1878. They had 5 teachers and 57 pupils. They said, as probably their advertisement, they to supply a want to the young men and other individuals who had no other place to which they could go. It must be slightly more popular than the Craghill Evening School, because their average attendance there was 43. And it'd been even higher than that, but as we're coming into sort of 1880, 1881, there'd been a bit of trade depression around that, a larger result of foreign imports hitting the mills, especially the cotton mills, and then the cheaper mills supplying, cheaper fabrics. They were being undercut at the time. There are also 2 private schools, or at least 2 private schools. It's very hard to determine from the census. There were quite a lot of teachers in Horsforth, but whether they taught at a national school, either of the national schools or one of the other ones, we don't simply know. And some of these might have just been dame schools, as they call them, where young children would have been sent to someone's cottage to be taught prior to going to the national school or one of the other schools, or it might have been a sort of private school as well. So we have Evangeline Poynton on Town Street. Her father was a confectioner. Later on, he supplies sort of meals to all sorts of things. So I guess he's sort of a bit of a baker, makes sandwiches and other things like that. And the 47-year-old former head of the Town Street school, William Milner, he runs the Horsforth Middle Class School from Pimlico on Broadgate Lane. The house still stands there today. Didn't last much longer into the 1880s. He probably retired, or they moved on because even his children were acting as teachers there. Quite amusing that it's a middle class school. So whether it was an upper class school in Horsforth or not, I don't know. But to say there's very, very little known about these. I only know a little bit about the ones that was established towards the end of the 1880s, which was in Airedale House, which is formerly Bill Bancroft's, and today is used as a Froebelian junior school or infant school down there. Funnily enough, it was the lady that founded for the Froebelian, Miss Ho, who taught in the Dame School down there. So I'll pick that up a little later on. So we discussed about the school. So let's know a bit more about the Mechanics Institute. Construction started on Monday the 7th of February 1880 and was due to cost £3,000. The architects were Milnes and France of Bradford. Charles France of Milnes and France actually lived in Horsforth on Outward Lane. He eventually comes to join the local board because he causes quite a lot of problems outside the local board by writing to them all the time, especially about Mr. Braithwaite, who lives at Throstle Nest, who I mentioned last week, who was coupling up his drains before anybody else was allowed to do so, and he didn't think that was right. And then the board seemed to have it in for Mr. France as well. He was pulled up on various things of putting litter into the woods on Outward Lane as well. He initially proposed an L-shaped building that would cost at least £5,000. And the idea from that is that the Mechanics Institute, as it is today, would have a large public hall behind it that would seat 700 to 800 people. This hall would stand behind the police station that already stood before the mechanics was started to be built. But it was deemed too expensive. They could probably afford the £3,000, and it did take quite a bit of time to pay off the last few £100 on that, but it was actually cleared by 1887, 1888, and because it had sort of proved its worth. Mr. Stanhope gave the land valued at £300, and the rest of the money was raised from the town. And that was through a lot of people subscribing to it, those people who are well off. They also had quite a number of bazaars and other things like that to raise the money into there. Like I said, this upset the Reverend Pearson, who lives in the vicarage on the green where the museum is today. He thinks that the money is rightfully his for the construction of the church on the hill. He even refuses to sign a memorial, which is, I guess, a piece of paper urging other people to fund it, put their hands in their pocket, and because other notables had signed in the town. So he was quite notable for his absence on part of that, and he wasn't even invited to the opening later on. The foundation stone was laid on the 8th of April, 1881 by Mr. Averdick. He's a man who lived at Knotfield House, who had 300 people arrive by train to his garden party. And because he was very big in St. Margaret's Church itself. The photograph I showed you is from the 1911 when they were trying to raise money for the building of St. Margaret's Hall. So he was always very big in that as well. And it started with a procession coming from Horsforth railway station, and at the front of that was a Horsforth brass band, and they marched to where the foundation stone would be laid. The mechanics had been formed in 1837, and this is what's quite surprising. It was formed by the then vicar of Horsforth, the Reverend Stocker, and but he said it wasn't particularly successful to begin with. After 4 years, folded and was said to be held on church premises. I can only imagine it being either in the bell chapel or being in the vicarage at that time. So it doesn't say. It reformed in 1850 and met in the Temperance Hall, and I don't really know much about the Temperance Hall, although I live in Temperance Court, but they must have had a separate hall somewhere. A wooden hut is mentioned much later on in about being on Broadgate Lane, and also on some of the maps it's shown as a Temperance Hall on Fink Hill as well. So if anybody knows any more about that, but when they met or reformed the Mechanics Institute, they had 200 members. And later on is when people sit down for having a breakfast in the Temperance Hall, there'd be 90 to 100 people sat down. So it's certainly not the property off Back Lane where Temperance Court is, because it's certainly not big enough. And I guess if you had 30 people in, you wouldn't be able to move, let alone sit down to do anything. So I'm not quite sure. And then in 1871, it moves into a 3-roomed cottage, or at least over 3 cottages that stood underneath, or perhaps a shop. It stood, they used a property at the end of Garden Street. Now, there were some shops at the end of Garden Street. This stands where the post office on Town Street is today. Garden Street behind it was a very dark, narrow place where the sunlight actually never reached the ground floor, and people also lived in cellars behind there as well. So as you'll see later on, they wanted to demolish Garden Street due to that purpose. And like I say, it was also overshadowed at the back by a great wall that went down it to divide it from the Grove Chapel next to it as well. One thing they didn't want to do was to leave the shops at the front, because they're seen as an amenity. So perhaps they met over these shops that looked onto it, but because I don't think there'd been any room in Garden Street behind it. And because they started their fundraising for the Mechanics Institute as built in 1877. So we're coming back to that next week when we see the opening of the Mechanics Institute as well. So let's look at we've been mentioning the Vicar of Horsforth and other things like that. This is a plan of the New Connection Methodist Chapel on Bachelor Lane. I must thank Susan Watson for sending me this over, just to, again, something slightly different to look at. And I say this, I'll come on to this in a minute. So on Hunger Hills, we have St Margaret's being built at the time, described as looking like a romantic ruin full of jackdaws nesting in there. And I think the word jackdaw was used by the reporter quite often. And I think that was sort of meaning maybe a seemingly hopeless cause, is that this church would never ever be finished being built. They had the first meeting about building St Margaret's on the 10th of October 1873, largely due to the overcrowding at the chapel on the Green. But we see even before then, going back to the sort of 1840s, is that it was so overcrowded then that's why Woodside Parish was created, to relieve the overcrowding in the chapel on the Green. On the 31st of January 1877, a contract was given to build the new church, and the architect was very renowned, the John Loughra Pearson, who was born in Durham in 1817. And I don't think he had a link with the vicar at the time, the Reverend Pearson, who lived in the vicarage, because he wasn't born in Durham, he was born further south. So I think it's just a coincidence that the architect and the vicar shared the same surname around there. He also built other churches around the place. I think he was St Michael's at Headingley he built, and I think his greatest one, I might pick it up later on where I've written it down, but I could say he was quite a notable architect at the time. The foundation stone was laid by Mrs Stanhope on the 28th of July 1878, and the cost is estimated to be £12,000. So add a couple of zeros onto that, I guess, to give you a rough estimate of what it was going to cost today. But work comes to a stop in October 1879. They've already raised £7,000, but they've run out of money. And they hold various fundraisers. Concert at the National School, St Margaret's today, is thinly attended, according to the reporter, because the tickets are too expensive. However, a further £1,200 is raised. I think Mr Stanhope chips in, and some other people do as well, to get a move on with the building of this. And work resumes on the 2nd of November 1880. But by the end of 1881, it's still not complete, and they've run out of money again. They still need a further £2,300. But reality of it is that people are heartily sick of putting their hands in their pockets to fund it. I think most of these people have also put their hands into the pockets to fund the Mechanics Institute, which they might deem as maybe play a greater role in the community of Horsforth. But one which was built very, very quickly, and the cost of £900, is this picture that we see here, the Methodist New Connection Chapel on Bachelor Lane. The old chapel is, I think, taken down, and I can say some of that stone reused for the building of the school. So I think the school behind it, the Sunday school, is probably built on the same layout as it was. That's why it's, if you look at the building on here as well, is how it sticks out as a single floor elevation to the back. But it was really the £900 being spent on the chapel at the front. The old chapel, I can say, demolition takes place on this site. It fits into the same building site that the old chapel was built on, and because they didn't have much room for that, and because that's demolished in the winter of 1881, and it's hoped that the contractors, all Horsforth businesses, will have it complete in spring 1882. So that'll appear next week on there as well. And for the first time in 1880, we found that the non-denominational Sunday schools, that's the Methodists and such on, around about 1,120 children, marched from Car Bridge or Station Road to a field at Lane Head. That will be next to Keith James Menswear, later on where they built the first tin tabernacle, the Imperial Cinema. Benjamin Lockwood writes a hymn. He's on the local board, and this is quite often is using a a familiar tune. I guess it comes back to On Ilkley Moor Batat. That's a tune that was written in the South, but becomes a popular hymn tune. And then people, obviously, on Ilkley Moor, rewrote the words to that tune. And I guess he chose a tune called Claremont, perhaps there's a house in Horsforth called Claremont, and he writes a hymn to that tune as well to be part of that event. So it's really gives an idea of how many non-denominational children there are around. So that was really not held at Whitsuntide, but really, I guess, as a jamboree in a type of way of getting all these children together to prove how popular and successful the Sunday schools are in Horsforth. So that's really what's going on in the churches at this time. The other main thing that was going on was in politics. We found the Liberal Club as an organisation, we're going to say without premises, was founded in October 1879. Most of the local board are Liberals, and Joseph Salter, who I mentioned before, he's in his early 30s, but it seems to be very highly regarded, and he's elected its first president. Others include the Reverend Rolls of Craghill Baptist Church and local board members, Mr. Braithwaite, Mr. Parkin, John Bentley of the Soapworks, and John Whittaker as well. He was I can't remember what it was now, actually, after I shouldn't have said anything. But it was important to them to have property, because if you didn't have property, you didn't get voting rights. And we see that out of a population of 3,000 or 4,000 people in Horsforth at that time, maybe coming up to 6,000, is that only about 1,300 people had voting rights as well. And what they wanted to do was attract younger people to become liberals, and therefore by having premises is that they could have games rooms in there. They would have a reading room where they could come in, read the papers without having to buy them, and also books could be loaned out as well, because there were no public libraries at this time, and because there wasn't going to be until the Mechanics became a library in 1918, and therefore you'd have to be a member of a private library and pay an annual subscription. So the idea, I guess, was that if you paid a subscription to become a member of the Liberals, is that you could use the billiard tables in there, and you could also pop in, read the papers and borrow a book as well. So they take 2 rooms above Mr. Mosey, who has a saddlery business on Town Street, one of these rooms for the reading room and the other as a recreation room. It's open from 10 a.m. in the morning to 10 o'clock at night, and they quickly attract 70 members. Relatively, they want 200 members, largely because the Conservatives have opened their premises exactly where it is today, next to Morrison. They opened that in 1880, and they already had 120 members. So there's this vying between the two, and that's why the Liberal Club were looking for premises at the time. We'll be picking up on that in the following years as well, where they actually did buy the premises where the car park is for St Margaret's School. And that's what's pictured on there, a former pub called The Crown. That's my link to the next photograph talking about pubs. And really what we see is that a number of these pubs were the centres of the social scene. And it seems that they were probably a bit more as a hotel in a way. And so the 3 principal ones was the Black Bull, the Old King's Arms and the Old Ball. They seem to have meetings there for sports clubs and for other events as well. So if people are going out for a meal, as there were no restaurants, you would go to one of those 3 pubs, maybe because the only other pubs only sold alcohol in them as well. And maybe the perception is that it was all right to go to one of those 3 pubs because you're going there to socialise with people perhaps of your own standing. So I guess maybe judging from that picture there is that we're sort of professionals might have gone in there as well. And the landlords were actually quite strict as well, especially in those three pubs. They didn't want any drunkenness or anything to highlight that was going in and that would attract the police attention. So it was very important that they kept their license as well within there. And we'll see that the Old Ball, which was stood slightly different location from where it is today, but the side onto where it is, that was where the Stanhope had their rent audits. That's where they invited the farmers along twice a year, because it was 6 monthly, and the farmers would come down there to pay Mr. Stanhope his rent for that period. He would also often come himself as well, so perhaps he thought it was important to know the farmers that were renting off him. And I could say, if he wasn't able to come, his agent, who lived nearby in Horsforth somewhere, Mr. Wemyss, would sit at the top of the table. The other person expected to be there was the Reverend Pearson, because Mr. Stanhope still held the advowson of St. Margaret's Church. That's the right to appoint the vicar. And so he was expected to attend because of that. Both the Black Bull and the Old King's Arms at the bottom of Town Street were owned by the Hutchinson family. John Hutchinson having the Black Bull and his brother James the Old King's Arms. But 1880 was a fateful year for both of the brothers. In July 1880, John, aged 34, died after falling off a children's swing. It's probably quite unbelievable that would happen, really. I say, he'd only been the landlord of the pub for a year, so that John held the Old King's Arms there. 13 weeks later, at the first week in October, his brother James dies of typhoid fever at the age of 37. It says in the report that the Hutchinsons have had the Old King's Arms for almost 100 years. They'd also had the pub refronted as well in the 1870s. He also holds Hilltop Farm and has been a member of the Horsforth Choral Society for 22 years. And that's why they'll have met in that pub as well. He leaves behind a wife and 3 young children as well. The Old King's Arms is then put up for sale in May 1881, but bidding stops at £2,000. But with the rebuilding and the actual value of the pub itself, it's estimated to be £2,325, so it goes unsold. And we see that most of the properties which are sold through auctioneers in the pubs, very, very few are actually sold, largely because of this trade depression at the beginning of the 1880s. And it tend to be cottages, pubs, shops, and other things like that that come onto market and don't actually get much money, and they're normally always withdrawn. I'll bring up a few later on as well. And there's no takers for the 106 acres of Clayton Woods, and that's valued at £16,000. So that'd be where the quarry is later, probably being done at the same time. So let's look at I mentioned the sort of sports and facilities where they normally met in pubs, because they'd be Grey Horse as well. Now the Brownlee Arms, they had cricket and football pitches at various times behind it as well. You probably see here, there's an advert here, one of the very few in the paper for any business or event in Horsforth, for the Horsforth Athletic Sports, tomorrow, Saturday. 400 entries, it says there. So this takes place on the Old Ball field, because that seems to be the centre of quite a lot of cricket and football and other things like that. Just before this event takes place, a new sport is introduced to Horsforth, the Canadian sport, as it proudly says, not in the advert but in the paper, of lacrosse. A demonstration is given on the day of Horsforth Athletic Sports in the Old Ball field in late June 1880. I think this is the advert for 1881 that we see here. This sports is really like a semi-professional event where some of the prize money, well, all the prize money totals £100. That's around £12,000 today. So you can see, looking down here, where these people come from. Chadwick and Nugent come from Rochdale, Barlow from Liverpool, Winterbottom, Manchester, Smith from Keighley, all well-known semi-professional runners who are, coming here because there's big prize money on it as well. So it's really to attract the best runners by, I guess, it's probably like a horse race. The greater the prize money, the greater the entries you're going to see. That's probably why it says at the top 400 entries on there. And the reporter says that he's on these races, it has never seen as many 16-year-olds in the under 16-year-old race along there. But with sort of this amount of money around, it also attracts the totes, the betting men who will take a bet on a race. The police are called in, and Sergeant Poyser has great difficulty in arresting the men, as everyone, if they are arrested, will lose money. And this is what it's quoted at in the paper. Other men who seem to be known to the prisoner, that's Samuel Hodgson of Wibsey, who's taking the bets, then joined in committing an assault upon him. He was struck several times, thrown to the ground, kicked, and otherwise roughly ill-treated, until a gentleman named Wilson and P.C. Anderson came to his assistance. And afterwards, he and his two protectors had difficulty in resisting the attack, which was continued. So this great fight takes place at the athletics sports. The betting men are sentenced to 3 months with hard labour. So they were quite rowdy events, obviously quite rough, and something that the Sergeant does wade into later on, as we'll find out, because he always seems to get a good kicking, maybe because he won't stand any nonsense, perhaps. We also have Horsforth Football Club that was formed in 1878. It moves from the Grey Horse, the Brownlee Arms today, to the Old Ball Field, so it's become very popular around here. The green is also used for the annual feast, but has outgrown it being held on the road. And in 1880, for the first time, it's held in a field behind the Black Bull. The Black Bull, that's right. And it's complained now that the feast is too spread apart. So it's not only behind the Black Bull, but it is on Think Hill as well. And in 1881, it transfers to what we now call the feast field behind the Brown Cow Beer House. And even in that first year when it's there, is that some other stores are still held on Think Hill as well. And again, the complaint is that it's too split up, and eventually it all comes to be held on Feast Field behind the Brown Cow. And that Feast Field every year seems to be very muddy. And even when I went in the late 1970s, I guess, it was still a mud bath then. But as the reporter said, people can still purchase toys for double the price. It's no different to today when it rolls up in the park. But it seemed to be declining as the years roll on, largely as a result of people using the feast. And this was held in the last weekend of August, really, when our bank holiday is today. And because the mills didn't seem to close down for a week, as people said, they would stop on Saturday lunchtime, and the mills would reopen on Thursday. And it seems that most people spent Sunday in Horsforth at the feast, but on the Monday, organised trips on the railway. Sometimes, if you got enough people, it would be the churches and the choirs that would go somewhere. And we see that they will go to places like Harrogate, Knaresborough, and other places. They even do the coast at Bridlington, or across the other side to Blackpool or wherever. So it seems to be that those were very long days. You had to get up early to catch those and come back very late at night as well. So that was sort of part how the feast had really changed, is that maybe there's a bit more money in people's pockets, and they were able to do this as large groups of people, tend to be not single people. But coming back to the feast, here's a flavour of the theatre that the reporter saw. And I must admit, I guess it took place in a bit of a tent as well. So this is quoting from him of what it was like at the feast in 1880 or 1881. And he says, you could almost imagine the heroine, a young and blooming damsel of about 65. She would be frightened out of her wits by the hero, a man of naturally unhandsome face. But she wasn't. She talked and talked and talked such nonsense that one felt almost inclined to wish her old gums would drop out. The monotony of the affair was certainly relieved to some extent by one or two little incidents that occurred, and which were not in the play. For instance, when the villain of the piece was retiring from the stage in one place, after making some awful threat or other, one of the audience, or whom either beer or a wholesome disgust of the piece had acted, shouted out, "Blow over, go, and I'll pours thou out of hoil." Again, when someone else was being a thief, this youthful spectator sang out at the top of his voice, "There's a liar, there's a liar, maester." I can say he ends up by saying that it deserves to be brought under the notice of the police, as in it's not actual theatre. And so that really takes it on, because really there's no park or other amenity for I guess young people and other people, and the local board recognised there's a need for a recreation ground, even recommending Hall Park to themselves. But as the paper observes, it's all talk, talk, talk. And like I say, that's all the local board is around. One of the other things that was sort of changing the landscape or the townscape of Town Street was the arrival in September 1880 of the first telegraph poles. They were first put along New Road side, being the main road, because they'll come out of Leeds and gone out to Guiseley as well. And they were then connected, as we can see here, up onto other properties, and going across there. A very modern thing, so it dates that photograph probably to after 1880. You also notice on here that it said that the Horsforth Harriers also met at the Old King's Arms as well. A company also wishes to bring electricity to Horsforth, but are rebuffed by the board, as I see it, of this company having a monopoly. They might have considered it, this is reading between the lines, if they were given places on the board, i.e. they would make a bit of money from it. But as no one's local involved in it, it's rebuffed. But we see in the sort of the next thing, as we'll see on this bit of cutting from here, I don't know if you can read it or not, but it's really about the big loss in late October 1880, the surveyor Isaac Wood hands in his notice, as he's really taken over the job as surveyor. But it's a big blow for them, because actually getting a surveyor who needs lots of skills, and they probably need a degree of dedication and a skin like a rhinoceros, is perhaps the local board's fault, because he's clerk of works to the cemetery as well. That's just been given him that year as well. He's also involved in the very early stages of the sewerage scheme that was going to come into Horsforth, and he says he's getting paid more over in Pudsey for doing less work. So maybe if they paid him a little bit more for all these things, or gave him an assistant, he might well have stayed. And rather than raise his salary or get him help, they advertised for another surveyor at the same salary. They received 62 applications, but 32 of these are thrown out as they come in after the deadline. They whittled those 30 odd down to 4 and interview them on a Saturday afternoon, because they wouldn't be at work at that time. The new surveyor they've employed is Mr. Mallinson. He starts on the 13th of December 1880, and one of his first jobs is to lead the board members around the town, because at the end of March every year they have an annual survey. So he's meant to be pointing out things that needed doing, not just the roads, but other things as well. The board then agrees with Mr. Mallinson. In fact, there should be a plan for the whole town, but nothing really ever becomes of this. It talk again. And they always finish at a pub, In 1881, it's the Stanhope Arms, where Mrs. Bolton, the worthy hostess, has provided an excellent tea. And it ends with countless backslapping and toasting one another. In fact, the toasting goes on for 2 or 3 paragraphs, as they seem to find a toast for everything. They also appoint a law clerk because it's been undertaken externally prior to this by a Mr. K. But they decided that paying Mr. K too much for his advice, and that if it's brought in-house, that they could it'd be a lot cheaper to do that. So they appoint a chap called Mr. Bowling, but the paper observes that the solicitor will be soon well practiced in giving advice on every conceivable question, but the chances are that the law clerk will find after a time that no great responsibility lies with him, as his advice, unless the members on the board change their skins, will rarely be acted upon. I just got 2 more slides here. And so one of them's quite a long one, but if you look at the sort of industry around here as well, is that we see a number of strikes. Looking down here at the dye works down here, owned by a Mr. Richardson at the time. Mr. Richardson lives at Waltair, which is this property here, still got it on the gate post today. This erupts in February 1880. They were demanding a 9-hour working day, but they were expecting wider public support, but don't get it. The works are owned by the Whittaker brothers. That's a Mr. Whittaker. I couldn't remember what he did earlier on. And so they dye suit linings down there, and unfortunately is that really they lose the contracts for a number of businesses who now go over and take their business across to Halifax. So they were benefiting, and this irks the dye workers down here. And so there must have been some agitation down there on Thursday, the 12th of February 1880, as it said that the police were now on hand if it broke out again. But the strike was probably crumbling at the time, because they really had to use their own savings to live on. Samuel Whittaker, one of the brothers, said he was reopening the dye works on Monday the 16th of February at 6 a.m. For anybody who wanted to work. On Tuesday, the strikers blocked Carvley Bridge. I guess the police weren't there at the time. They were probably stopping the mill workers at the other end, at the Rodley end of Carvley Bridge, maybe those who went up to Wood Bottom Mills and the other dye works at the end of Low Hall Road along there, probably to try and get them to do that, because they've had an open air demonstration down there. One wonders whether they had to pay the toll to cross there to have a demonstration. But at the beginning of March, the drying house of the dye works catches fire. I think Mr. Whittaker, who lives at Waltair, says it's near enough at the bottom of his garden. So this dye works, probably the dye house is probably this part of a property that stands, next to the railway line down there. And it's a 2-story building, 30 yards long. And but fortunate for him is that the people who live down there doused out the flames with buckets of water, I guess from the river, forming some sort of human chain around there. But still, £4,000 worth of building materials and equipment is lost. But arson isn't suspected at the time, or even later on. And then we have some sort of industrial accidents as well. Most notable for the local board is of William Hudson in November 1880. He's on the board. He's also the corn miller of Troy Corn Mill that stood just below the railway station there. He was feeding straw into a machine and it rips his fingers off. He's taken down to the LGI in Leeds in extreme pain, but has to have his arm amputated. I can see he's on the local board, and he was on the board of the Wharfdale Guardians as well. We just elected 2 to go into that to represent Horsforth. So for the rest, he does recover, and obviously he goes around having lost his arm around there. Mr. Richardson's Steelworks, that stands where they're going to build the Lidl supermarket. That's off Low Lane. 30-year-old Thomas Garrick dies when lifting a grindstone with other men. He probably sits aside a bench and with a grindstone. It's been quite a small one, this. I guess it's the type of thing that the cutlers would have used in Sheffield. So it would sit aside there, the grindstone probably being about 10 inches, 11 inches wide or something like that. So it wasn't a great heavy stone, but they have to replace them quite often. And I understand there's some stuck in a wall down there as well. So you can actually, I'm not quite sure where it is. I've not seen them, but they are the old grindstones down there. Then you can see the photograph of them, but they're not particularly big. But they easily break, and you can say the flying debris from a grindstone could actually be fatal as well, because it probably hit you at great speed on the head. But he doesn't die from that. He actually seems to have had a heart attack and dies on the scene. His inquest into his death is held at the Stanhope Arms. It seems though that anybody who dies is taken to the pub nearest to them. On this, you'll see that his name has been misspelled as Gar Carrick or something, but he lived at the bottom of Back Lane, and I guess his cottage was either in the Stanhope Arms car park or just on the other side. That's why he's been taken there. And in the 1881 census, he dies just before this, probably, I think, in the March of 1881. In the census of April 1881, his poor wife, I think she's 27, he's 30 when he dies, with 3 children aged between 3.5 and 6. And also coming to help is Mr. Garrick's mother, who's probably come to help out, look after the children as well. But not an accident per se is that the local board have found employing a boy of 10 years old to break stones. Is that, again, it's coming down to them being sort of trying to save money, but in fact don't, is that rather than have road stones shipped in, sometimes from Ribblesdale and other places, it comes by canal and then brought up to where it's needed and left in great mounds. Quite often it's found to be far too big to lay on the roads, and therefore they have to employ people to smash the stone up to make it smaller. So that's what this 10-year-old boy was doing, and then suddenly find out having to pay for this labour is that it's actually more expensive than actually getting the smaller road stone in as well. And you can say, on the other hand, we see some of the industrialists being benevolent. Benjamin Whittaker, they're of the Whittaker family who live at the end of Outwood Lane, have the quarries in Horsforth woods. They take their staff to Hull to see the stone being used to build the dock. So it's quite interesting that, and we'll see next time, is that because the Whittakers, one of the Whittakers is on the local board, is that we see the other industrialists on there also taking their staff out as well, as we'll see next week. But the last one I'm looking at today, because it's a bit of a longer story, but it's the fire at the silk mill that takes place. They'd had a fire in 1877, and now just over a little 3 years later, another one started at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 17th of July, 1881. The mill belonged to John Heaton Charnley and was bought in a curious way. He had a background in the textile industry at all, but he seemed to have come into some money and found that the silk mill at Woodside was up for sale. The vendor was a chap called James Harling, and Charnley kept him on as the mill manager and paid him £4 a week, so a great sum of money in those days. So locals tried to put out the fire, but couldn't. And so the telegraph has to be sent to the Leeds Fire Brigade. And that took 50 minutes to come, largely because it at that time, it would have to go on Burley Road and down Butcher Hill, all along Low Lane. These were all unmade roads at the time as well. And because the fire equipment was pulled by 4 horses as well. And so that the able to, as they call it, the steamer, they link their pipes to the reservoir behind the mill and pump away like mad. This part of the mill stands 6 stories high, because it's not this one that you see here. This is the rebuilt mill of later on in the 1880s. And so it's 50 yards long and 20 yards wide. And it's a bit of this old mill. It's a bit of a perhaps an L shape, I'm not quite sure, but this part was the old mill, and then they built on an extension to this as well, but they weren't interlinked. So there's a solid stone wall in between these buildings that stood linked together. And after an hour, the fire was put out. The damage was estimated at £5,000 to stock and machinery. The next day, less than 24 hours later, a second fire broke out at the mill at the other end of the main building, so the one that hadn't been affected by the first fire. And at 8 o'clock, the fire engines were called out at 8 o'clock at night, and the foreman of the mill, a chap called John Capstick, had said from the previous fire that he'd keep watch to make sure that it had been completely doused. The last of the fire brigade left at 8 p.m. But at 1 o'clock on the Monday morning, so because just a few hours after the last fireman had gone, is that a man coming either from a house or walking along Low Lane at that time saw a fire at the other end of the mill. And so the man went and got Mr. Capstick up. He lived in a cottage on this site. So let's say perhaps this property down here. All these industrial buildings actually had people living on them. I guess the fear of fire and other things is that there was somebody nearby. Mr. Richardson, who owned the steel works where they make hackle pins for the linen industry, he lives in a house on there. We've also mentioned before about the rope works at the bottom of at the bottom of Broadgate Lane. Is the chap who owned that lived, Mr. Parkin, who's on the local board. He also lived in a house near enough on the site as well. So anyway, Sergeant Poyser is informed as well. He's sent off the telegraph, I guess, to the fire brigade to come back again. And he gathers people together, I guess, knocking people up as they go along, to come and put this fire out. He orders Capstick to unlock the mill, but he takes 15 minutes to come back with a key to say that his house only stands less than 30 seconds away from it. And Sergeant Poyser again gets a chain of buckets, said to involve 100 people at this time, to try and extinguish the material in there. But it was impossible. And you can say the machinery had caught fire as well. I guess it's from the oil and other things used. And so they have to wait another 50 minutes for the fire engine to come out. But by the time they arrived, the sergeant of the brigade says, really, there's nothing can do. He puts the water pipes onto them for 4 hours to try and save the mill. But the fire had leapt to the abutting mill. That's the one where the first fire took place, and it burnt the whole lot down. They remained there until 9 in the morning. So they spent a sort of 7 hours to try and put it out as well. But all the machinery was a massive tangle, and the walls of the mill had started to fall down as well. So it was unusual, this case. So the Sergeant Poyser telegraphed somebody down at the police force in Leeds, and they come out to inspect the damage to see what's going on. It puts around about 120 people out of work. Mr. Spence and Mr. Wild of Troy Mills, that's the one which still stands there, which I called Ackroyd's Mill, which is now into apartments. They take on some of the workers from it, and there were calls on other manufacturers to take on staff who had lost their jobs. And there were also calls for Horsforth to have its own fire engine. It never happened, and it takes, I think, a dozen years or more of arguments before they actually agreed to co-own one with Yeadon, and that will be stationed at Yeadon as well. The insurance companies, who had actually been courting Mr. Charnley's business to sign up with them, and it actually only just changed insurance companies as well. And say he'd insured the whole buildings for £25,000, and that's what he was expecting this as a payout for that. And but the insurance companies are a bit wary about this and actually put up a reward for £500 as arson is suspected. £500 leading to someone being jailed for doing that. So again, a lot of money, I guess £50,000 in today's money or something like that. We hear no more about the mill until it comes into court in February 1883. So that means we'll be hearing about it next week as part of